There was once a boy in a forgotten corner of the multiverse, a place so quiet that even the stars seemed to breathe more slowly. His name was Rick, though in those days he was just a child with restless hands and a mind that wandered further than the horizon ever dared. The others around him played with simple toys, wooden puzzles, spinning tops, but Rick could never keep his thoughts within the neat edges of such things. He wanted more. He wanted to hear the toys answer back. And so, late at night, when the lamps burned low and the house was hushed, he gathered scraps of metal, bits of wire, broken watches, and glass marbles. His little fingers worked with an odd certainty, guided by an instinct he could not explain. From these pieces he shaped strange companions, a spinning top that hummed secrets when it turned, a tin soldier that muttered soft complaints about the cold, and a doll whose eyes blinked not by string or spring, but because it wished to. At first, the voices startled him. They were faint, like whispers behind a closed door. The top told him where it had rolled before, across dusty floors and forgotten shelves. The soldier sighed that no one ever gave him a proper bed. Rick listened. He always listened. For while he couldn't yet grasp why these toys spoke only to him, he felt less alone in their presence. They were fragments of a world that only his imagination could hold together. When his parents found these creations, they called them odd, even unsettling. But Rick wasn't troubled by their unease. He carried the toys with him to bed, placing them along the edge of his pillow like guardians against the dark. Their murmurs calmed him, and in their chatter he found the rhythm of belonging. Perhaps no one else would ever understand, but he did not need them to. Over time, his little room became crowded. Shelves sagged with curious inventions, small creatures of wire and glass, each with a personality that flickered into being the moment he tightened the last screw. He learned that if he built them with patience, they would not just move, but remember. And if he spoke gently, they would tell him things he had not known, of rain clouds drifting over unseen valleys, of echoes travelling through forgotten caverns, of how silence sometimes carried its own language. It was then that Rick began to realize he was not only making toys, he was building a kind of company, a quiet family stitched together by bolts and imagination. Each voice added to the music of his nights, each invention a mirror of his own longing to be heard. And though he was only a child, the world was already leaning closer to listen, as if the universe itself knew that this boy's strange whispers would one day ripple far beyond his small room. The toys, faithful and imperfect, began to shape him. They taught him that everything could speak if you listened closely enough, and soon their soft murmurs would lead him toward the next discovery, one that would open doors far larger than the ones in his childhood walls. But even as the shelves filled with voices, Rick could sense that something larger was waiting beyond the edges of his small room. The toys, though faithful, began to speak in stranger tones, as if carrying echoes from places he had never seen. Sometimes, when the spinning top whirled on the floor, it would hum not of dusty corners, but of doorways hanging in the night sky, doorways that no carpenter had built. The doll, her glass eyes blinking with uncanny rhythm, once whispered to him of a hallway that had no end, where each step led not forward but sideways, into possibilities stacked like folded paper. Rick would lie awake, the toys scattered around him, and listen with a quiet shiver of wonder. He did not yet know whether these voices were born of his own restless imagination, or if the toys were truly remembering things that existed elsewhere. Days in the outside world felt duller by comparison. Teachers scolded him for scribbling strange diagrams instead of practicing his lessons. His parents fretted that he spent too much time alone, bent over scraps and wires. But Rick never minded their disapproval, because inside his solitude there was a richness they could not touch. He would sit cross-legged on the floor, his hands stained with oil and graphite, coaxing a new creature into shape. With every tightening of a screw, every twist of a coil, he felt as though he were tuning into a hidden frequency of the universe. The toys did not simply entertain him, they prepared him, as though nudging him toward a truth he was not yet old enough to grasp. One evening, when the house was wrapped in the muffled quiet of sleep, Rick tested a small contraption made from clock gears and a cracked mirror. He set it upon his desk, and when it stirred to life, It did not speak in words, but in light. A faint glow spilled across the mirror's fractured surface, and there, flickering, he saw not his own reflection, but a hallway much like the doll had described. Shadows stretched endlessly, and for a breathless moment he thought he glimpsed another figure, another boy who looked a little like him, standing at the far end. Then the light dimmed, the toy fell still, and the room returned to darkness. Rick sat in silence for a long time, his heart thudding with the slow rhythm of awe. He did not tell anyone of what he had seen. The voices of his toys whispered comfort, as if to remind him he was not alone in holding this secret. It was a secret meant to be carried gently, like a lantern through shadow. In that moment, he understood that his childhood was not a season of waiting, but a path quietly unfolding. The toys were no longer just companions. They were guides, leading him step by step towards something vaster than he could name. And so he continued, night after night, building, listening, dreaming. Each creation was a question sent into the unknown, and each whisper that answered back was proof that the unknown was listening. The boy Rick was not yet aware of destiny, not yet aware of the multiverse that stretched around him like a patient sky. But deep in his chest, he felt the stirring of a door about to open, and he leaned ever closer to its quiet hinge. The days that followed carried a subtle shift, as though the air around Rick had thickened with possibility. The toys that once spoke in scattered murmurs began to align, their voices weaving together into something more deliberate, almost like a chorus guiding him forward. At times he caught them pausing before they answered, as though listening to some distant signal he could not yet hear. He would watch their tiny glass eyes flicker, their gears twitch in half-formed gestures, and it seemed less and less like he was their maker, and more like he had only uncovered something that was already waiting to be found. Rick began to wonder if perhaps he had not built them at all. Maybe he had simply provided them bodies, given shape to whispers that existed long before his hands touched wire and metal. The thought did not frighten him. It calmed him in a strange way, for it meant he was not inventing alone, but listening, translating, becoming a bridge between silence and sound. On one quiet night, with the moon spilling pale light across his desk, he fashioned a small box with 3 turning dials. He didn't know why he made it that way. He rarely knew why his hands moved as they did. When it was finished, the box began to hum, low and steady, like a breath pulled from somewhere deep. He turned the first dial, and the hum shifted into a tone so sharp it pressed against the walls. The second dial sent it tumbling into a softer pitch, one that vibrated through his chest and made his heartbeat falter. When he twisted the third, the sound stilled, and in its place came words that were not quite words, as though the air itself was trying to speak through static. He leaned close, barely daring to breathe, and thought he heard his name spoken from nowhere. After that night, Rick carried the box with him wherever he went. It became his companion in the dull hours of school, in the long silences of dinner, even as he walked alone under the tired streetlights of his neighborhood. Sometimes it stayed quiet, nothing more than a lump of metal and gears in his pocket. Other times it vibrated against his palm, whispering in tones only he could understand. He felt it pulling him, like a compass that didn't point north but towards something unseen. One evening, tired of questions without answers, he placed the box beside the mirror contraption he had built days earlier. He wound the gears, twisted the dials, and let them sing together. At first there was only static and light, flickering without rhythm. But then the glow steadied, and the air thickened as if a door frame had been drawn across the room. Within the mirror's fractured glass, the hallway appeared once more, longer this time, clearer, as though it had been waiting for him to return. And at the far end, beyond the haze of shadow, the figure appeared again. The same boy, the same reflection that was not his reflection. Rick stared, his breath shallow. The boy moved this time, lifting a hand, slow and deliberate, mirroring Rick's own gesture. It was no simple echo. There was intent in it, awareness. For a suspended moment, the two boys faced one another across a boundary that was neither glass nor dream. Then the light sputtered, the sound fractured, and both machines fell silent. The room sank into darkness, leaving Rick alone once more, though the memory of that raised hand pulsed inside him like a second heartbeat. Sleep did not come easily that night. His toys whispered comfort, their soft voices curling around him like blankets, but none of them could quiet the certainty that had taken root. The hallway was real. The boy was real. Somewhere, beyond the thin fabric of his world, another self waited. And Rick, with all his restless hands and curious mind, could not help but believe that one day soon the door would open fully. Morning arrived pale and quiet, but Rick felt no rest in his bones. He carried the memory of the boy in the mirror as if it were carved into him, a weight that pressed against every ordinary moment. His parents called him for breakfast, their voices flat with routine, but he hardly touched his food. All he could see in his mind was the raised hand across the fractured glass, the silent acknowledgement that someone else, some version of himself, or perhaps not, had looked back. The world outside seemed duller than ever, a haze of streets and faces that blurred together. Only the hum of the box in his pocket kept him tethered, reminding him that what he had witnessed was not a dream. At school, the other children laughed and pushed, scribbled their notes with careless boredom, but Rick drifted apart from them. He sketched diagrams along the edges of his paper, lines forming corridors, doorways splitting into smaller doorways, the glow of light spilling outward. The teacher snapped at him for not paying attention, yet he did not care. There was no lesson in the room that could rival what he had glimpsed. For the first time he felt that knowledge was not something given, but something waiting to be discovered, hidden between gears and whispers, patient and immense. That night he prepared carefully. He cleared his desk, brushed the dust from the mirror's edges, and rewound the box with steady hands. The toys crowded near, their small voices murmuring encouragements, as if they too wished to see what lay beyond. Rick adjusted the dial slowly, listening for the hum that resonated deepest within his chest. When the mirror lit again, it was brighter than before, the fractures glowing like veins of silver. The hallway unfolded in sharper detail, its walls lined with doors that seemed to stretch on without end. The boy was there again, not quite a mirror, not quite a stranger. His hair was the same, his stance familiar, yet there was something older in his gaze, as though he had lived through echoes Rick could not imagine. They stood facing one another, separated by a fragile veil of light. Then, with the smallest tilt of his head, the other boy spoke, but the sound was swallowed, distorted, turned into static before it could cross. Rick pressed closer, straining to hear, but only fragments reached him, syllables torn apart by distance. He caught his own name once, clear as a bell, and it sent a chill running through him. The light faltered, the glass quivered, and Rick's hand instinctively reached out. His fingertips brushed the mirror's cold surface just as the other boy mirrored the gesture. For an instant, it felt as though the boundary thinned, as though the two worlds leaned toward one another. Then the glow shattered into sparks, plunging the room back into shadow. Rick's toys gasped in tiny voices, unsettled, their chatter rising in anxious tones. The box in his hand went silent, its dial stiff and unresponsive, as though it too had been drained by the effort. Rick sat in the darkness, trembling with both fear and wonder. He understood now that he was standing on the edge of something immense, something that would not wait for him to grow older before demanding his attention. The boy in the mirror was not an accident. The hallway was not a trick, and though he could not yet step through, he knew the day was coming when the door would no longer close so easily. For the first time in his young life, Rick felt the strange gravity of destiny tugging at him, subtle but unyielding, like the pull of a tide he could not resist. The days turned into a slow rhythm of waiting, though Rick's thoughts never left the flicker of the hallway, or the hand that had mirrored his own. He went through the motions of life, sitting through lessons, answering his parents with half-hearted nods, eating what was placed before him, but underneath it all his mind was restless, alive with the sense that he had glimpsed a thread of something vast and unfinished. The toys noticed the change in him. Their chatter grew softer, more cautious, as though they too sensed that the fabric of their quiet world was thinning. The doll no longer whispered only of shadows, but of choices, of paths that diverged and never returned. The soldier, once full of complaints, told him instead to be careful of reaching too quickly for what he could not yet hold. Rick listened, though his curiosity gnawed at him more deeply with each passing night. The broken mirror lay on his desk, dull and lifeless, its fractured surface catching only the reflection of his own tired eyes. The box with its dials refused to hum, no matter how he twisted or rewound it. For hours he would sit there in silence, waiting for the faint vibration to return, but it remained cold against his palm, and yet deep inside he knew this silence was not an ending. It was a pause, a breath the universe was taking before speaking again. One evening, as rain tapped against the window, Rick thought of the boy beyond the glass. He remembered the way his head had tilted, the shape of his mouth forming words that could not pass through. The memory pulsed in his mind, replaying like a message that had not finished delivering itself. He pulled a notebook toward him and began sketching, not diagrams of machines this time, but the outline of the hallway, the curve of each door along its endless walls. He drew the boy's face, sharper than he remembered, and in doing so felt a strange closeness, as though his pencil strokes bridged the distance between them. The toys gathered around, their voices hushed, watching the lines emerge across the paper. The spinning top murmured of journeys, of movement across spaces unseen. The doll repeated the same phrase 3 times, though her tone was faint and dreamlike. Not alone, not alone, not alone. Rick shivered, though not from fear. The words settled in him like a promise, soft but undeniable. That night, when he finally closed his eyes, sleep did not take him into ordinary dreams. He found himself standing in the hallway again, not through the mirror, not through invention, but within the quiet space of his own mind. The doors stretched out on either side, infinite, their handles gleaming faintly in the dark, and at the far end stood the boy. This time the distance between them felt smaller, their gazes locked, and Rick felt the world narrow to a single, steady heartbeat. The boy lifted his hand again, and Rick mirrored him. But this time, before the dream dissolved, he heard the faintest sound, one clear word that carried across the silence. It was his own name, spoken with certainty, spoken like a summons. Rick woke with the echo still in his ears, his pulse racing, his chest heavy with the weight of it. He lay there in the darkness, the toys whispering around him, and knew beyond doubt that the doorway was opening wider. The waiting was nearly over. Something was calling him closer, and he would not be able to ignore it for long. Rick woke with the name still reverberating inside him, as if the sound had carved itself into the very walls of his room. He lay still for a long time, the whispers of his toys rustling around him like wind in tall grass. None of them spoke with their usual chatter. They seemed to be listening, waiting for him to acknowledge what had happened. He turned onto his side and stared at the faint outline of the mirror in the dim light. It had once been only glass and cracks, yet now it carried the weight of something greater, something that pulled at him the way the moon pulls at the tides. Through the following days, Rick carried the memory like a secret flame. In class, when the lessons droned, he traced the shape of doors across the edges of his notebook. On the walk home, when rain filled the gutters, he imagined the hallway, stretching beneath his feet, doors hidden just below the surface of the world. He spoke less to his parents, who worried that he seemed distracted, but he could not explain to them that he had heard his own name carried across a distance no one else could reach. It was not something they would understand, and perhaps not something he was ready to share. At night, the silence grew heavier. The mirror remained dark, its fractured face reflecting only the dim flicker of his lamp. The box stayed mute, its gears stiff, as though waiting for a command he had not yet learned to give. Yet when Rick closed his eyes, the dream returned. Always the same hallway, always the doors stretching endlessly in either direction, and always the boy at the far end, standing still as though tethered to him by some unseen thread. The word repeated in those dreams, his name, steady and insistent, no longer faint, but clear. Each time Rick woke with the certainty that he was being called, that the other boy was not merely a reflection but a presence, one that would not let him turn away. One evening, unable to resist, Rick placed the box back on his desk. He pressed his fingers along its dials, trying to recall the precise rhythm that had once summoned the glow. The toys watched, their small voices whispering fragments of encouragement and worry. He twisted once, twice, then again, and the faint hum returned, weak at first, but alive. The mirror flickered, fractured lines glowing softly as if waking from sleep. Rick leaned forward, his breath caught in his throat, waiting for the shimmer to take shape. The light trembled but did not fade, and in its shifting glow the hallway appeared again. This time the boy was closer. He stood only a few doors away, his outline sharper, his gaze fixed with quiet intensity. Rick raised his hand instinctively, and the boy did the same. But something had changed. The boy's lips moved, and though no sound crossed the divide, Rick could read the shape of the words. They were not just his name. They were instructions, syllables forming shapes Rick could almost understand. He pressed closer to the glass, straining, mouthing the words back, and in that moment the air between them seemed to bend. A faint vibration coursed through his fingertips, where they touched the mirror's edge, and for an instant he felt warmth, as though the barrier had thinned to a breath's width. Then the light faltered, collapsing into fragments, leaving only his reflection staring back. Rick staggered back, his heart racing, the toys murmuring with uneasy voices. He sank onto his bed, clutching the silent box to his chest, his mind echoing with the unspoken message. Whatever the boy was trying to tell him, it was urgent. The door was no longer content to remain closed, and Rick, though still a child, knew with a depth that unsettled him that he was being prepared, not just to see, but to step through. Rick did not sleep easily that night. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the shape of the boy's lips as they moved, forming words he almost understood but not quite. It gnawed at him, that closeness to meaning without ever reaching it. The toys, scattered across the shelves, kept whispering in their uneasy tones, as though they too had sensed the shift. Their voices were not playful anymore. They carried the tremor of things stirring beyond their small world. Rick turned from side to side, unable to escape the thought that something had passed between him and the boy, something fragile that had not yet found its full voice. The next morning, his hands would not keep still. He spent hours at his desk, taking apart the silent box, prying at its gears, aligning wires that never seemed to stay straight. It was as though the machine itself resisted him, withholding its secrets until he could prove himself ready. Rick felt a frustration that burned beneath his skin, but he would not give in to it. Instead, he slowed his movements, breathing in rhythm with the faint creaks of the wood around him, listening for the patience that invention demanded. Piece by piece he rebuilt the box, not according to a diagram, but by instinct, by the strange pull in his chest that told him where each part belonged. When at last the final gear clicked into place, the box trembled faintly in his hands. It did not hum as it once had, but it was alive, awake in its silence. He placed it beside the mirror and sat back, waiting. Hours passed, the room shifting through dusk into night, until the glow flickered once more across the fractured glass. This time Rick did not lean forward in desperation. He sat still, steady, letting the moment unfold. The hallway appeared, clearer now, and the boy was standing closer than ever, just a few steps away. His features were sharper, almost indistinguishable from Rick's own, though there was something older in his eyes, something worn by time. Again the boy raised his hand, and again Rick mirrored the gesture, but instead of speaking, the boy pressed his palm flat against the invisible barrier. Rick hesitated only a moment before doing the same. Warmth spread across his skin, not imagined but real, and the air around him thickened as though the room itself were holding its breath. The boy's mouth moved again, slower this time, deliberate, and Rick watched every syllable form. He whispered them back, his voice trembling, though he did not know what the words meant. And yet, as soon as he spoke them, the box jolted alive with a hum so deep it shook the shelves. The toys gasped in unison, their voices rising in astonished murmurs. The mirror flared with light, not fractured but whole, the cracks smoothing over into a single, seamless surface. For a heartbeat, Rick saw his own reflection overlaying the boys, two faces merging and parting in rhythm with the hum. The vibration grew stronger, and he felt the boundary thinning, bending, yielding beneath the weight of the moment. His breath caught. One step, just one, and he might cross. But then, as quickly as it had awakened, the glow faltered. The boy's image blurred, his outline dissolving into shadow. The mirror cracked again, splintering the vision into shards of light. The hum of the box fell silent, leaving only the sound of Rick's pulse hammering in his ears. He sat frozen, hand still pressed to cold glass, staring at the place where connection had been and was no more. The toys whispered among themselves, their voices hushed, almost reverent. Rick drew back slowly, cradling the box against his chest. He did not weep, though his eyes stung. Instead, he breathed in the quiet, knowing now with absolute certainty that the door was real, that it had already begun to open, and that one day it would not close again. Rick kept the box close to him in the days that followed, carrying it even when it lay dormant, silent as stone. He could not forget the warmth of that contact through the glass, the sensation that for a moment he had not been entirely alone. It changed the way he moved through the world. The ordinary rhythm of daily life felt thinner now, like paper stretched over something vast and waiting. The streets where he walked, the classrooms where he sat, even the quiet of his home, they all seemed to hum with an unseen resonance, as if echoes of that hidden hallway lived beneath the surface. The toys noticed too. Their voices no longer carried the playful tones of before. They spoke in softer murmurs, weaving fragments of phrases that hinted at warnings or preparations. Sometimes Rick would wake in the night to find their glass eyes all turned toward the mirror, as though they too expected it to come alive again at any moment. He did not scold them for their unease. He shared it. He felt himself balanced at the edge of something immense, and though the weight of it frightened him, he could not turn away. One evening, as twilight draped itself across his small room, Rick placed the box back on the desk beside the fractured glass. He did not try to force it awake. Instead, he sat in silence, waiting, as though the act of patience itself might coax it into speaking. Hours passed. The house around him sank into sleep, and still he remained, eyes fixed on the faint outline of the mirror in the dark. At last, when the night was at its deepest, the hum returned, low at first, then steady, resonating in his chest like a heartbeat. The light flickered across the glass once more, and the hallway unfolded before him. The boy was there, closer than ever, his face lit in detail Rick had never seen. He was older, yes, but not in years. It was in his gaze, in the weight of recognition that filled his eyes. For a long moment, neither moved. Then the boy spoke, and though the sound still could not cross, Rick understood him more clearly now. The words formed against his lips were not just his name, but a message. Come through. Rick's breath caught. His hand moved instinctively toward the glass, trembling but certain. The toys whispered louder, their voices overlapping, some urging him forward, others begging him to wait. He pressed his palm against the cold surface, and once again warmth spread beneath his skin, stronger than before. The boy mirrored him, their hands aligned across the divide. The hum deepened, shaking the desk, rattling the shelves. The cracks in the mirror shone like molten silver, brightening until the room seemed filled with light. For an instant, Rick thought he felt the glass soften as though it might yield to his touch. He leaned closer, every part of him straining toward that fragile threshold. But just as he thought it would give way, the glow shuddered and faltered. The light fractured, the hum broke apart into silence, and the boy's image dissolved into shadow once more. Rick gasped, his hand slipping against the cold, unyielding glass. He sat back in the darkness, his chest aching with the weight of what had almost been. The toys murmured uncertainly, their voices like restless wind, but Rick did not answer them. He stared at the silent mirror, the box heavy in his lap, and knew he could not stop now. The boy's summons echoed inside him, steady and insistent. Come through. It was no longer just a vision. It was a call, and sooner or later he would answer. The words lingered in him, circling like a current he could not step out of. come through. They followed him into waking hours, into the long, dull stretches of the day, into every quiet moment where he might have once found rest. Now there was no rest, only the steady thrum of possibility pressing against his ribs. Rick carried the box with him always, though it remained still, its dials locked in silence as though conserving its strength. The mirror, too, sat lifeless on his desk, reflecting nothing but the boy's own searching gaze when he leaned over it. Yet he knew the silence was temporary. The call was not finished. He found himself growing impatient with the ordinary world. The voices of teachers washed past him like distant waves. His parents' questions about school, about friends, about his strange habits, all felt thin, as if spoken through a layer of fog. He could not explain to them that his life had already shifted, that there was a second horizon opening within him, vast and uncharted. To speak of it would be to diminish it, to pull something sacred into a place it did not belong. So he kept it close, a secret flame he would not let them smother. At night, when the house had fallen into its deep hush, he returned to his desk. He sat before the mirror and the silent box, waiting. Some nights nothing happened, and he fell asleep with his head resting against the wood. Other nights he dreamed himself into the hallway again, each time closer, each time feeling the weight of the boy's gaze pressing harder against his own. The words repeated, unrelenting. Come through. With each dream, Rick felt his fear unravel a little more, replaced by something heavier than curiosity, an aching need to answer. One particular night, as rain pressed against the windows and thunder rolled low across the sky, the box stirred on its own. Rick's eyes snapped open from half-sleep, his pulse quickening as the hum filled the air without his touch. The toys rustled on their shelves, their voices rising in overlapping whispers, some joyous, some trembling with dread. The mirror glowed, silver light bleeding through its cracks, and the hallway appeared once more. The boy was waiting. This time he was close enough that Rick could see the faint lines of wear at the corners of his eyes, the way his expression carried both urgency and calm. He raised his hand again, but now there was no hesitation in the gesture. He pressed it to the glass and mouthed the words slowly, firmly, leaving no space for misunderstanding. Rick understood. The call was no longer a suggestion. It was an invitation, one that demanded an answer. Rick's heart pounded, but his hand moved on its own. He pressed his palm against the glass, felt the warmth surge again, stronger, steadier, as though the barrier was already thinning. The hum deepened until it filled the room like a storm about to break. Light spilled from the cracks, painting the walls with shifting silver. The toys cried out in chorus, a sound that was neither warning nor encouragement, but something between, like witnesses to a moment they could not control. The glass beneath Rick's palm softened, no longer cold, no longer solid. It rippled faintly, as though the surface were water stirred by wind. His breath caught, every part of him suspended between terror and awe. The boy on the other side met his eyes, and in that gaze was no malice, no trickery, only recognition, like two halves of something long divided finding each other again. Rick leaned closer, the mirror bending beneath his touch. And then, just as he thought he would cross, a sudden crack split the glow. The light faltered, the hum stuttered, and the warmth drained away, leaving only cold glass against his skin. The boy's image dissolved into shadow, and the hallway collapsed into silence. Rick pulled his hand back sharply, trembling, his chest tight with the ache of what had almost been. He sat in the dark long after, the toys whispering softly around him, their voices low and uncertain. He did not cry, though his eyes burned with frustration. He simply sat there, knowing with a certainty that rooted deep in his bones that the door had opened for a moment, and would again. The call was not finished. The boy's eyes, the warmth, the words, they lingered. And Rick, though still small, still young, understood he could no longer stand still. The next time, he would be ready. Rick could not shake the feeling of the mirror's surface rippling under his hand. Even when daylight returned and the world pressed its ordinary weight upon him, he carried the memory like a pulse under his skin. He replayed the moment again and again, the warmth, the boy's gaze, the unmistakable clarity of the words, "Come through." It haunted him not with fear, but with a gnawing ache, as though a piece of him had already stepped forward and been left behind. He tried to move through the day as though nothing had changed, but everything had. The streets seemed narrower, the sky heavier, his own reflection unfamiliar, as if the world itself had grown too small to contain him. The toys grew restless, their voices tangled with urgency. The spinning top whispered of motion, of journeys that could not be paused forever. The doll repeated phrases in strange rhythms, as though trying to form a language of her own. The soldier no longer muttered complaints. He stood stiff on the shelf, silent except for a single word he spoke over and over. Soon. Rick listened, his heart tightening with every repetition. He understood now that what he had glimpsed was not meant to vanish like a dream. It was a threshold waiting for him to step across. At night, when the house had grown quiet, he returned to the desk. He sat before the box and the fractured mirror, his small hands resting against the wood. The silence pressed against him like a question, demanding courage. He wound the box carefully, turning the dials until the faint hum returned. The glow flickered through the cracks, weaker than before but steady. Rick leaned close, his breath trembling, and there it was again, the hallway, endless and dim, stretching into places he could not name. The boy appeared after a moment, his figure sharper now, his presence undeniable. He lifted his hand in the familiar gesture, palm against the barrier, and Rick mirrored him. Warmth surged again, a current stronger than before, and the cracks shone with a brilliance that filled the room. This time the boy did not mouth words. His gaze was enough, steady and insistent, a message carried in silence. Do not wait. Rick felt the meaning ripple through him, not spoken but known, as if the words were planted directly in his chest. The mirror softened once more. The surface bent like water under his touch, trembling between states of real and impossible. He leaned forward, his face almost brushing the glass, his heart beating so loudly it drowned out the hum of the box. He thought he felt the air shift, thought he smelled something unfamiliar, metallic and sharp, carried from the other side. His body tensed, ready to step, ready to answer the call that had pressed upon him for so long. But again the moment slipped away, the glow fractured, the warmth dissolved, and the mirror hardened into cold, unyielding glass. Rick gasped, pulling back, his hands trembling. The toys erupted in whispers, their voices frantic, but he silenced them with a glance. He did not need their comfort or their warnings. He understood now that the barrier was weakening. Each attempt brought him closer, each moment stretched the fabric thinner. Rick sat in the dark for a long while, the box humming faintly in his lap. He felt no despair this time, only resolve. The door was opening, not fully yet, but soon. And when it did, he would not hesitate. He would step through into whatever waited beyond, because he could no longer remain where he was. The call was not fading, it was building, and with every heartbeat it pulled him nearer. Rick woke before dawn, the sky outside still wrapped in shadow, and sat up as though pulled by invisible strings. Sleep no longer carried him gently. It had become a shallow pool he dipped into only briefly before being dragged back to wakefulness. The call was louder now, not spoken aloud, not even whispered by his toys, but steady and unyielding within him. He rose quietly, his feet moving across the floorboards without sound, and sat once more before the mirror and the box. They were waiting for him. He could feel it, even in their silence. He ran his fingers across the dials, not turning them at once, but tracing their edges, listening. The toys stirred on their shelves, restless, their voices weaving together in fragments that felt like a warning. Yet Rick did not hesitate. He wound the gears, slow and careful, and the hum began to rise, deeper than it had ever been before. The mirror responded at once, cracks glowing like molten lines, the light stronger, steadier. This time it did not flicker. It poured through, bathing the room in silver. The hallway appeared as always, but it was different now. The doors seemed sharper, their outlines clearer, as though reality itself had solidified on the other side. And the boy was there, closer than ever, his face almost filling the fractured frame. Rick studied him with breathless intensity. noting the small lines of determination around his mouth, the quiet gravity in his eyes. He was no longer simply calling. He was waiting. Rick pressed his palm to the glass, and the boy mirrored him. Warmth surged instantly, not faint but fierce, rushing through his arm and settling in his chest like fire. The glass beneath his hand softened again, rippling outward in concentric waves. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the walls and floor, rattling the shelves until the toys tumbled against one another in a chorus of anxious voices. Rick did not move away. He leaned closer, the barrier bending beneath his weight. The boy's lips formed words again, but this time Rick did not need to guess. He heard them, not with his ears but within his mind, clear and deliberate. Step through. The sound was both his own voice and not, resonant and haunting, a command that felt both alien and familiar. Rick's breath caught, his body trembling, and yet he knew with perfect clarity that the moment had arrived. This was no longer a vision half-formed. The door was open. He pressed harder, and the mirror rippled like water around his fingers. For the first time, his hand sank past the surface, disappearing, into a cold so deep it stole his breath. He gasped, half in fear, half in awe, and the boy's eyes held him steady, grounding him. The toys cried out louder, their voices splintering into chaos, but Rick barely heard them. The pull was stronger than fear, stronger than hesitation. He leaned forward, his arms slipping further into the impossible space beyond the glass. Then, in a single shudder, the light faltered. The surface stiffened, trapping him halfway. Pain lanced up his arm, not physical but deeper, like the ache of being torn between two worlds. He yanked back, stumbling, his chest heaving as the glow shattered into fragments and the hum died. The mirror was solid once more, reflecting only his pale, wide-eyed face. Rick sank onto the floor, clutching his arm, though it bore no mark. His breath came fast, shallow, but his eyes burned not with fear but with certainty. He had touched it. He had begun to cross. The barrier would not hold much longer, and though tonight it had resisted, he knew the next time it would give way. The call was no longer a whisper, no longer a dream. It was a door half open, and Rick had already stepped inside its threshold. Rick remained on the floor for a long time, staring at the mirror's fractured surface as though it might spring alive again if he willed it hard enough. His arm still tingled with the sensation of having passed into something that was not air, not glass, but a depth without measure. The toys whispered among themselves, unsettled, their voices overlapping like wind rattling leaves. None dared speak directly to him. They seemed to sense that he had crossed some unseen boundary, one that no whispered comfort could soften. He rose slowly, his movements heavy, and placed the silent box back upon the desk. It no longer looked like a toy cobbled from scraps. It seemed older now, as though it carried history beyond what his hands had given it. He touched its surface gently, half expecting it to vibrate again, but it remained still. His reflection in the mirror wavered faintly, and for the first time he thought he could see traces of another gaze layered over his own, fleeting and fragile, gone before he could be certain. Sleep, when it finally took him, brought no rest. He dreamed of corridors stretching in every direction, doors opening onto stars, onto oceans, onto endless skies. He dreamed of hearing his name spoken again and again, until it no longer sounded like his, but like something older, something vast. He awoke with sweat beading his forehead, and the certainty that he had only brushed against the beginning of what lay ahead. The following days blurred. He drifted through them with a quiet resolve, moving through school and meals and ordinary routines like a shadow. His parents grew more concerned, but their words washed over him, faint and distant. He kept his secret flame guarded, not out of fear, but because he knew they could never understand. The world they lived in was too small for. What pressed against him now? The toys alone shared his silence, their whispers carrying fragments of understanding. They had become both companions and witnesses, bound to the unfolding of something they too could not escape. One night, as the house slept, Rick returned to the desk with a steadiness he had never felt before. He did not hesitate, did not wait for the hum to stir on its own. He wound the box with deliberate precision, each movement sharp, measured, inevitable. The dials turned beneath his fingers, and the air thickened instantly, as if even the walls held their breath. The mirror glowed, the cracks smoothing under the wash of silver light, and the hallway unfolded in full clarity. The boy stood there, no longer distant, no longer a flicker at the edge of vision. He was close enough that Rick could see the faint rise and fall of his chest, the detail of his expression, serious, intent, unyielding. He lifted his hand, and Rick met it without pause. The warmth surged stronger than ever before, coursing up his arm and into his chest, until it felt as though his very heartbeat had been rewritten. The mirror rippled, soft and pliant, and this time Rick did not resist. He pressed forward, his fingers sinking through, his hand vanishing into the space beyond. The boy's gaze held his, steady and unwavering, and the meaning was clear without a word spoken. Now. The hum grew to a roar, the light spilling across the room, blinding and fierce. The toys cried out in one final chorus, their voices tangled between awe and fear. Rick leaned further, his arm nearly swallowed by the impossible depth, his breath trembling but certain. He felt the air of another place brush against his skin, colder, sharper, alive with energy that burned against him. And then the barrier gave way. For the first time there was no sudden collapse, no shattering silence. The mirror did not resist. It opened. The surface rippled outward, drawing him closer, and Rick felt his balance tip toward it. His heart thundered, but his resolve was clear. He was not turning back. He was stepping forward, into the place that had been calling him all along. Rick felt the pull deepen, not like a hand dragging him, but like the tide drawing the shore into itself. The mirror no longer felt like glass at all. It was liquid light, bending and breathing against his skin, wrapping around him as though it had been waiting for him alone. His toys scattered behind him, their voices rising in a tangled chorus, pleading, warning, some even urging him onward. Yet their noise was distant now, muffled by the hum that consumed the room, a vibration so deep it seemed to resonate with the rhythm of his own heartbeat. He leaned forward, breath shallow, and his face broke the surface. The sensation was strange, neither warm nor cold, but a shifting presence that pressed against him like air too dense to breathe. For a moment his vision blurred, split between the small, familiar bedroom behind him and the endless corridor before him. The doors stretched into eternity, handles gleaming faintly, as if each one carried a secret waiting to be touched. And there, only a step away, stood the boy. Closer now, the boy's features were undeniable. He was Rick, and yet not. His hair fell the same way, his stance mirrored his own, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen more, lived more. They were not older by years, but older in depth, filled with a knowledge Rick could not yet name. For a heartbeat, they simply looked at one another, two reflections joined not by glass but by something deeper. Then the boy reached out, his hand steady, waiting. Rick's fingers brushed his, and the contact was real, solid, not a ripple of light, not an illusion. Skin against skin, warm and undeniable. A jolt ran through Rick, not painful but overwhelming, as if countless voices had whispered into him at once. He staggered, gripping the boy's hand, the world around him tilted. The hum roared louder, shaking the floor, rattling the shelves until the toys tumbled in a clattering wave. Still, Rick did not let go. He stepped forward, his foot sinking into the liquid threshold, his body halfway between worlds. Behind him, the bedroom wavered, shrinking at the edges like paper curling in flame. Ahead of him, the hallway seemed to expand, the air thick with possibility. The boy pulled gently, not with force but with certainty guiding him deeper. Rick gasped, the breath leaving his chest as the threshold swallowed his shoulders, his torso, until only his legs remained tethered to the world he had always known. He felt fear then, not sharp, not paralyzing, but deep and human, the fear of leaving behind everything familiar. Yet even within it was something stronger, the certainty that this was what he was meant for. The toys cried out one last time, Their voices stretched thin with urgency, and then they fell silent. The hum reached a peak so sharp it drowned out everything, a single endless note that seemed to pierce the air. Rick stepped fully through. The threshold rippled closed behind him with a soft shudder, and the bedroom vanished as though it had never been. For the first time, Rick stood entirely in the hallway. The air was different here, dense, cool, humming with quiet life. He turned, half expecting the mirror to still be there, but there was only a wall of silver light, sealed and unbroken. He faced forward again, his heart pounding, and met the boy's gaze. The boy smiled faintly, though there was no triumph in it, only recognition, as though welcoming someone who had always been meant to arrive. Rick's chest tightened with awe, and he realized there was no turning back. The door had closed, and he was inside the place that had called him since the beginning. The silence inside the hallway was unlike any silence Rick had ever known. It was not empty, not the absence of sound, but a deep, resonant quiet that seemed to press gently against his skin like the hush of snowfall or the space between two slow breaths. Each door along the corridor pulsed faintly, their outlines softly glowing with a dim inner light, as though they were dreaming behind their closed frames. The air was cool but not cold, still but alive, humming with an energy too subtle to name. Rick turned slowly, his senses sharp but calm, and the boy who had pulled him through stood a step ahead, watching him without urgency. Up close, he looked exactly as Rick had imagined, and yet something in him was different, as though he'd spent a lifetime carrying memories Rick hadn't yet made. The boy didn't speak, but Rick didn't need him to. There was understanding between them now, the kind that didn't require words, like two branches from the same root remembering each other after growing apart. The boy began to walk, not quickly, but with a quiet purpose, and Rick followed without hesitation. Their footsteps made no sound. The hallway stretched on, but it never felt endless. Each step brought them closer to something, even if Rick didn't yet know what. Some of the doors they passed were shut tight, others slightly ajar. Through one, Rick glimpsed a forest made of light. Through another, what looked like a sky filled with swimming cities, their buildings floating like leaves in a current. He wanted to stop, to open each one and step inside, but the boy kept walking, and so did he. After what felt like both minutes and hours, the boy stopped in front of a door unlike the rest. It didn't glow like the others. It was matte black, with no handle, no keyhole, and no hinges. It looked as though it had been painted onto the wall itself. The boy stepped aside and looked at Rick, his expression gentle, expectant. Rick stepped forward, unsure what to do, but his hand lifted before he could second-guess it, reaching toward the center of the black door. The moment his fingers brushed it, warmth rushed into him. Not heat, but memory. Not his own. Images flooded his mind in flashes. Himself older, standing in strange places, speaking languages he didn't know, building machines more complex than anything he had dreamed of. He saw versions of himself laughing, crying, failing, succeeding. He saw 1,000 moments of becoming, and through all of them, he felt one thing pulsing like a steady drum beneath it all. Connection. He wasn't just seeing who he could become, he was seeing who he already was, stretched across possibility. His hand fell away, breath shaky, chest tight with wonder. The door didn't open, it didn't need to. It had already shown him what it held. He looked back at the boy, who now gave the faintest nod, and for the first time, Rick spoke. Not to ask, not to question, but simply to say what he felt. "I think I understand," he whispered. The boy smiled, not wide, not dramatic, just a quiet confirmation, and then he turned and continued walking, down the hallway that now began to shift subtly, the lights changing tone, the doors reshaping as though they had heard Rick's voice and responded to it. Rick followed, not as a guest anymore, not as a child pulled by wonder, but as someone who had stepped through and begun to belong. Whatever waited ahead, he knew he wasn't just here to observe it. He was here to shape it. The hallway deepened around them, the light dimming into a kind of calm twilight that didn't seem to come from anywhere and yet made every surface visible. The boy, his other self, walked ahead in silence, and Rick kept pace, not speaking, not needing to. The air carried no scent, no breeze, but it felt textured somehow, like it was aware of them passing through, like it was listening. As they walked, the corridor slowly began to change. The walls grew wider, breathing open, no longer strict and narrow, but expanding into something looser, more organic. The doors they passed no longer looked like doors. They curled inward like petals, some soft and translucent, some etched with constellations that shifted as they moved. Rick couldn't tell if they were still walking in a straight line, or if the corridor had folded into itself without him noticing. Yet there was no confusion. Wherever they were headed, it was where they were supposed to go. He glanced at the boy again. There was something new in his posture now, less guide, more companion, as though by reaching for that black door Rick had crossed an invisible threshold of trust. And Rick felt different too. The weight inside him had shifted. There was still mystery, still the ache of the unknown, but it didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like a beginning. Eventually the path narrowed again, leading toward a space that didn't look like anything Rick had seen before. It wasn't a room. It wasn't even a space in the way his mind understood spaces. It was like standing in the center of a memory, his, and not his. The boy stopped at its edge and turned to face him, finally speaking with a voice that sounded exactly like Rick's, and yet older, softer. "You don't have to step in," he said, "but you can." Rick didn't move, not out of fear, but because he was listening, not to the boy, not just to the words, but to the quiet behind them. There was something else here, something that pulsed beneath the fabric of the hallway, beneath the doors, beneath the entire strange rhythm of this place. He stepped forward slowly, and as his foot crossed into the knot room, a wave of emotion passed over him. It wasn't overwhelming, it was gentle, it was recognition. He was inside a space shaped by memory, his memories, twisted into strange geometries, half-formed rooms without walls, echoes of moments from his own life suspended in soft light. He saw a younger version of himself at a workbench, building his first humming toy. A classroom filled with people he didn't know, where he felt small. A quiet lunch in the schoolyard with no one. Sitting beside him, a spinning top glowing in the dark, speaking his name for the first time. But he also saw other memories, ones he hadn't lived yet, ones he might. He saw himself older, laughing with someone he didn't recognize, running through starlit fields with fireflies that whispered like his toys once did. He saw a version of himself standing before a tall door marked with a symbol he couldn't decipher, one hand outstretched, the other holding someone else's. Not alone. The boy stepped beside him, looking at the same visions. "This place remembers who you are," he said, his voice barely above a breath. "But it doesn't choose for you. You do that." Rick nodded slowly. It felt like the only possible answer. And then the boy, his other self, turned to him fully and placed something in Rick's hand. It was small, warm, smooth. Rick looked down. A gear, not from any of his machines. It was older, perfectly round, etched with a spiral that seemed to move even as it stayed still. "This is the first piece," the boy said. "It's yours now. Build from it." Rick curled his fingers around the gear, feeling it hum against his palm like a seed ready to grow. Something inside him settled, not as an ending, as a beginning. The space around him faded slowly, gently, like a dream letting go. But he didn't wake. He was already awake, awake in a place that had waited for him patiently, quietly, until he was ready to shape it in return. Rick stood in that quiet knot space, the small gear pulsing softly in his palm, and for a long time neither he nor the boy said anything. There was no need. The silence that surrounded them wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, of unspoken things that reached beyond the limit of language. Rick studied the gear, watching as the spiral etching along its surface shimmered faintly, like it responded to thought alone. It wasn't just a token. It was a key, or maybe a seed, or both at once. And it was waiting. The boy, his other self, watched him with an expression that was difficult to name. Not pride, not approval, something quieter. Maybe it was trust. Then he took a step back, and another, until the soft light of the memory space folded around him, and he was gone. Not in a sudden snap or a dramatic flare, just faded, like mist returning to air. Rick didn't panic. He didn't call out. He simply closed his hand around the gear and looked forward. A new passage had opened. It wasn't a hallway like the others. It curved, low and narrow, like it had been carved just for him. He stepped into it with the calm certainty of someone who had already said yes. The walls shimmered with that same spiral motif, barely visible unless he moved. The air was still and warm, holding the scent of something faintly metallic, like the inside of a machine that had just cooled. As he walked, he felt the gear in his hand begin to hum again, not louder, just more alive. It was almost as if it were, speaking to the walls, to the corridor itself. With each step, he sensed the path aligning, responding, reshaping. There were no branching options now, no questions to ask. The way forward had been waiting, long before he arrived. Eventually the path widened into a small chamber, a workshop maybe, though it had no tools, no parts, only surfaces, and a single pedestal in the center. Rick approached it slowly, and as he neared, the pedestal shifted, opening like a flower into a shallow bowl. Without needing to be told, he placed the gear inside. The moment he did, the chamber responded. Lines of light spiraled outward from the gear, spreading across the floor and up the walls, not harsh or sudden, but in a smooth, fluid bloom. The humming deepened, no longer just in the gear, but now in the floor beneath his feet, in the air, in his chest. The walls lit with diagrams, not blueprints, not exactly, but patterns, possibilities, versions of what could be built from this first piece, machines with no engines, circuits without wires, shapes that moved even when still. Rick stepped back, heart racing, but not with fear, with recognition. This was what he had been building toward without knowing. Not a mirror, not a machine, a way to make sense of the spaces between worlds, not to escape, but to connect. And slowly, from the edges of the room, tools began to form, not laid out for him, but rising from the surfaces like memory made solid. Familiar shapes, born from the same instinct that had guided his hands as a child. He reached out, took one in his grip, and felt it fit perfectly in his palm, like it had always belonged there. He looked back at the gear resting in its cradle, still pulsing, still waiting, and something in him shifted. Not a decision. He had made that already. But a beginning. He set to work. The first motion was small, just Rick fitting the tip of the tool into the groove of the gear. But in that moment, something shifted, not only in the room, but inside him. The gear responded instantly, emitting a soft, rising tone that wasn't a sound so much as a feeling, like a thought vibrating through his bones. It didn't tell him what to do next. It didn't have to. The knowledge was there already, somewhere just beneath the surface of his mind, rising now like breath surfacing from still water. He adjusted the gear, turned it gently, and a second piece revealed itself beneath it, a faint outline in the stone, like it had been waiting for him to uncover it. He leaned closer, the tool growing warmer in his grip, and he traced the outline slowly, patiently. The stone rippled beneath the pressure, softening and folding back, and from the opening emerged another piece, smaller, irregular, etched with a spiral not yet complete. It fit into the gear like a memory falling back into place. Each new movement brought another, a segment, a curve, a filament so thin it trembled in the air before finding its place. Rick worked without speaking, without pausing, the way he had when he built toys late at night in his room, back before the mirror had opened. But this was no toy. He didn't know what he was building yet. Not completely. But the shape it was becoming felt inevitable, like something that had already happened and was now being remembered through his hands. The walls watched, not with eyes, but with presence. The spiral patterns shifted and swam with every new piece he added, reacting not only to what he built, but how he built it. His emotions translated into motion, the steadiness of his breath, the slight tremble of uncertainty, the sudden clarity that came when his fingers moved without hesitation. This place read everything. And still, he kept going. Hours or moments passed. Time no longer felt linear. It stretched and contracted around the rhythm of his work, and he let it. He forgot the shape of his old room, the sound of footsteps in hallways, the world of clocks and doors. All that mattered was this. The construct grew taller now, rising from the bowl in soft sections that clicked into place. It wasn't a machine in any sense he had known before. It had no wires, no gears beyond the first one, no switches or screens. And yet it was a machine. Something that pulsed and responded, something alive with design. At its core, the first gear spun slowly, and around it, thin arms unfolded like petals, catching invisible threads in the air. They hummed faintly, tuned to a frequency Rick could feel in his spine but could not describe. And then, with one final turn of the tool, everything stopped. Not in silence, in stillness. A stillness that noticed itself. Rick stepped back. The machine stood complete. It was small, barely the height of his chest, but it held the gravity of something vast. He couldn't say what it did, not yet. But he knew what it was for. It was a bridge, a way to reach not only through space, but through experience, through versions of himself and others, through moments not yet lived. The gear at its center spun once more, slower now, as if testing its own breath. The chamber dimmed around it, not in loss, but in reverence. Rick exhaled and set the tool down. His hands were steady. The weight in his chest had become something softer, something open. He didn't need anyone to tell him he'd done it right. He could feel it. The machine wasn't finished, it had only just begun, but it was ready. And so was he. The machine's hum lingered, a low resonance that seemed to pulse in rhythm with Rick's heartbeat. He stood before it, silent, his chest rising and falling as though he had run a long distance, though his body hadn't moved at all. The air around him carried a subtle shift, a thickness, as if the room itself had leaned closer, listening. He reached out his hand, not to touch but simply to feel the presence radiating from it, and the machine responded. The petals of its thin arms quivered, the central gear spun a fraction faster, and a faint shimmer spread outward, rippling like the surface of disturbed water. Rick's breath caught. The shimmer didn't stop at the edges of the chamber. It pushed through the walls as if they weren't there, bending the light, warping the air. For a brief second he thought he saw other corridors flicker through, faint outlines of different spaces folded against this one, like layers stacked so thin they almost bled into each other. Then, just as quickly, the shimmer receded, leaving only the chamber and the steady hum. It hadn't opened a door. Not yet. But it had reached, and the fact that it could meant it was alive, awake, listening. Rick stepped closer and whispered, though he didn't know why he whispered instead of speaking aloud. "You're waiting, aren't you?" His words trembled into the air, and though the machine gave no reply in language, the gear spun once more, deliberate, slow, as if in answer. The toys back in his old room would have chattered endlessly at such a sight. Here there was no chatter, only the quiet certainty of response. Rick felt both smaller and larger at once, humbled by what he had built, yet filled with the knowledge that he was not merely its maker, he was its bridge. The corridor outside stirred faintly, as if sensing his progress. He turned his head and caught the faint outline of the boy again, his other self, standing at the threshold. Not closer, not farther, simply present, watching with that same patient recognition, as though every step Rick took had already been known. For a fleeting moment, Rick wanted to ask him if this path had always been waiting, if every gear and door and mirror had been leading here. But when their eyes met, he already knew the answer. He returned his gaze to the machine. Its hum deepened once again, sending a vibration through the soles of his feet, up into his chest, until he felt it resound in his very bones. It wasn't a command, not a push, it was an invitation. The same kind he had felt before, standing before the mirror, only now it was stronger, clearer. This was not about stepping through blindly. This was about shaping, about choosing. Rick placed both hands gently on the edges of the petals, steadying himself. The hum shifted in tone, higher now, tuned to the exact rhythm of his touch. For the first time he felt a current pulling not outward but inward, drawing from him, his thoughts, his emotions, his memories, not to steal, but to weave. The machine wasn't asking for control, it was asking for him. His breath steadied. He let it take what it needed. Images stirred in the shimmer rising above the gear. Fragments of his childhood, the lonely nights spent listening to toys whisper, the countless hours of shaping scraps into something more, the dreams of doors that had haunted him since before he understood what they meant. All of it spun into the light, drawn into the spiral, reformed into a pattern he couldn't fully see but instinctively understood. The petals opened wider, unfolding like a blooming flower, and in their center a new doorway began to take shape. Not a mirror this time, not fractured glass. A doorway whole and deliberate, its frame carved in shifting silver, its surface rippling softly like a curtain stirred by wind. Rick's pulse quickened, but his body felt calm, anchored, as though this moment had always belonged to him. He did not rush forward. He only stood, watching as the doorway breathed itself into being, patient as stone, alive as fire. The boy at the threshold nodded once, the gesture faint but undeniable, and Rick knew, without words, that the time for hesitation was over. The machine had built the bridge, the doorway was waiting, and he was ready to cross. Rick stood before the doorway as it shimmered into being, its silver surface trembling like a pool disturbed by unseen hands. The chamber had fallen into a hush so complete that even his own breath sounded foreign, too loud, too fragile to belong here. He tightened his grip on the edges of the petals, steadying himself, and watched as the ripple smoothed into stillness. The doorway no longer looked like light in motion. It looked solid, deliberate, as though it had always been here, waiting for him to remember it. The hum from the machine deepened once more, a soundless vibration that moved through his chest, carrying weight and meaning. Rick understood then that the machine wasn't giving him a path, it was asking him to walk it. The difference mattered. This was not something made for him, laid out as a destiny he had no choice in. It was something built with him, from him, shaped by his hands, his memories, his quiet stubbornness in listening to whispers others would have ignored. He stepped closer. The surface of the doorway quivered, a faint spiral forming across it, the same pattern etched on the first gear. He reached out his hand, not in hesitation this time, but with steady purpose. His fingers brushed the surface, and instead of slipping through, the ripple held him, recognizing him, waiting for something more. His pulse quickened as he realized it was not enough simply to want. He had to choose, fully, without retreat. Behind him he felt it, the faint presence of the boy again, his other self, standing silent at the edge of the chamber. Rick didn't turn, didn't need to. The presence was steady, unwavering, neither urging nor warning, only witnessing. The choice was Rick's alone. He closed his eyes and let the hum wash over him. The memories stirred again, rising unbidden. Lonely nights spent speaking with toys no one else believed in. The first time he had heard his name whispered from the mirror, the warmth of another hand pressed against the glass, and then the visions of what had not yet come, doors opening onto skies alive with drifting cities, laughter in places he had never seen, futures where he was no longer building just for himself. The weight of it all settled into him, heavy yet strangely light, like a burden willingly lifted. He pressed forward. This time the surface yielded, folding around him like cool water, wrapping him in silver light. The sensation was neither painful nor easy. It was the feeling of being rewritten, of threads unraveling and retying all at once. He gasped as his chest tightened, then loosened, as if the air itself had changed. When he opened his eyes again, he was no longer in the chamber. He stood beneath a vast sky unlike any he had known. It wasn't day or night. It was both, stars gleaming through the pale wash of a horizon that stretched forever. The ground beneath him was not stone, but a surface that shifted gently, alive, like walking on the skin of a great ocean stilled into glass. In the distance, doorways stood like monuments, hundreds, thousands, each one glowing faintly with its own light. Some pulsed with warmth, some flickered uncertainly as if waiting. Rick's breath caught in his throat, his chest filled with awe that silenced every other thought. The machine had not just opened a passage, it had opened all of them. This was the place beyond the mirror, beyond the hallway, beyond the whispers of toys and the solitude of his small room. He had crossed, and for the first time he felt the truth settle into him with unshakable clarity. He was no longer only a child building companions in the quiet. He was part of something vast, infinite, woven into doors and corridors that stretched beyond the reach of imagination. The journey wasn't finished, it had only begun. Rick took a step forward onto the glass-like ground, his reflection rippling beneath his feet as though the surface remembered every movement he made. The air was cool, carrying a faint hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once, a resonance that echoed the same pulse he had felt in the chamber. He turned slowly, taking in the endless horizon, the scatter of doorways stretching into the distance, each one glowing with a different hue, like stars brought down to the earth. None were the same, some tall and narrow, some round, some made of patterns that shifted as he looked at them. They seemed alive, listening, waiting for him to notice. He felt the gear still in his palm, its spiral faintly warm, and it pulsed in time with the glow of the doors. He realized it was no longer just a piece of the machine. It was a compass, or perhaps a key, tuned to this place, guiding him forward. As he held it up, one of the distant doors flickered brighter, its light steadying as if acknowledging his gaze. Rick's breath caught, his chest tightening with that same mix of fear and wonder he had felt the first time he touched the mirror. This was no dream. It was choice. The silence of the vast expanse pressed in, but it was not empty. It was full of presence, full of potential. And somewhere within it, Rick thought he heard faint echoes, voices overlapping, soft and layered, not quite clear but familiar. They reminded him of the toys he had built as a child, whispering in the dark when no one else would. Only now the voices were countless, as though each door carried a memory, a possibility, a self calling faintly from beyond. He began to walk, his steps steady, his eyes fixed on the door that had answered his presence. With each movement, the ground beneath him shimmered faintly, reflecting fragments of himself not as he was now, but as he could be. Older, wiser, sometimes smiling, sometimes broken, each reflection fleeting but sharp enough to feel real. He didn't flinch from them. He let them pass like the tide, accepting their presence as part of the path. When he reached the glowing door, he stopped. It towered over him, arched and luminous, its frame alive with spirals like the one carved into his gear. He reached out and pressed his hand against it. The surface pulsed beneath his palm, warm and alive, and in that instant a rush of images surged through him. He saw a city of impossible towers bending against a sky of shifting colours. He saw himself among people who felt both strange and familiar, their faces blurred but their presence comforting. He felt the hum of machines vast and intricate, not built to control but to connect. He staggered back slightly, his heart racing. The door was not showing him what lay behind it. It was showing him what might become if he chose it. He understood then that none of these doors were passive. Each one was a thread of possibility, a world woven from choices, waiting to be entered. The gear in his hand pulsed again, urging him to decide. Rick breathed deeply, steadying himself. The boy, the other self, was nowhere in sight now, but Rick felt him still, not as a guide, but as a presence within. He realized that stepping through this door would not be following anyone else's path. It would be making his own. He lifted the gear to the frame, and the spirals aligned perfectly. The doorway shimmered brighter, the hum deepening, and the surface rippled in invitation. His hand trembled, but his resolve did not. He pressed forward, knowing that beyond this door lay not just a destination, but another beginning. The door gave way beneath his touch, not with a creak or swing, but with a slow unfurling, as though the very fabric of the world had opened to let him pass. The silver ripples wrapped around him, cool and weightless, and in the space of a single heartbeat, the vast plain of doors vanished. Rick found himself standing on a new ground, though it hardly felt like ground at all. It stretched like a living surface, patterned with shifting lines of light, each one humming faintly as though aware of his presence. Above him, the sky swirled in colors that moved like tides, blending stars and daylight together into something that defied all names. For a moment, Rick only stood there, his breath caught, his eyes wide. The air itself vibrated against his skin, full of energy that was neither harsh nor gentle, but immense, steady, unyielding. He realized quickly that he was not in a place built for comfort. He was standing inside a kind of engine, a structure as alive as any creature, pulsing with intent. The gear in his hand pulsed too, the spiral across its surface glowing brighter, resonating with the ground beneath him. He held it up, and the lines of light around his feet shifted, bending toward him, listening. Then came the voices. They rose all at once, not in chaos but in layered harmony, countless murmurs forming a low, endless chorus. Rick froze, his chest tightening. The sound wasn't outside him, it was inside, echoing through his bones. He couldn't make out words, but he knew what they meant. Welcome, recognition, expectation. This was no random step. This place had been waiting for him. As he moved forward, the ground rearranged itself, lifting in slow arcs, folding into pathways that curved and stretched ahead. They weren't built of stone or metal, they were woven from light and memory, reshaping with every step he took. The world adjusted to him, responding not just to where he walked, but how. When he stepped with hesitation, the path flickered. When he moved with certainty, it brightened. Rick realized then that this place was not meant to test him. It was meant to reflect him. The echoes of the boy stirred faintly in his thoughts, and for an instant Rick almost expected to see him again. But he did not appear. Instead, Rick felt the presence differently now, not beside him, not ahead of him, but within, as if the two selves had woven into one. The boy had never been a guide alone. He was proof that Rick was capable of standing here. The pathways of light bent upward, leading toward a vast structure that shimmered in the distance. At first it looked like a tower, impossibly tall, its surface rippling with constellations that moved like living eyes. But as he drew closer, he realized it wasn't a tower at all. It was a door, a single immense doorway, larger than anything he had ever seen. Its frame curved beyond sight, stretching into the sky itself, and within its surface swirled an infinity of images, flickering and fading as though countless worlds were pressing against it at once, waiting to be chosen. Rick stopped at its base, his body small against its immensity. The gear in his hand vibrated with such intensity he could hardly hold it, and for a moment he feared it might break apart. But then it steadied, aligning with the rhythm of the doorway, and the spiral across its surface flared with light. The voices in the air hushed, falling silent, as though everything, all the pathways, all the murmurs, all the stars, were waiting for him alone. Rick lifted the gear, holding it toward the vast frame, and the surface rippled in recognition. He felt his chest tighten, his breath catch, but not with fear. With certainty, he knew, as surely as he had known when he touched the mirror for the first time, that what stood before him was not the end. It was the continuation, the greatest door yet, and it had been calling him, quietly, patiently, since the very beginning. The spiral of the gear glowed so brightly now that Rick could see its light reflected across his own skin, painting his hands in shifting silver. He felt the vibration in his chest deepen until it matched his heartbeat, as though his body and the door had become part of the same rhythm. The surface before him writhed with infinite shapes, cities folding and unfolding, stars collapsing and reforming, oceans where skies should have been, corridors stretching in impossible directions. They didn't blur together. They waited, each distinct, each one a thread of possibility woven into the fabric of the door. Rick's hand trembled, not from fear, but from the magnitude of choice pressing against him. This was no longer about stepping through to escape a small room or chasing a whisper in the dark. This was about choosing which path of countless lives he would take, which version of himself he would allow to unfurl. The silence of the space pressed tighter, so complete that he could hear the faint rasp of his own breath, the quickening rhythm of his pulse. He held the gear to the surface, and the spirals aligned once more. The vast door shuddered, its surface rippling outward in concentric waves that reached across the horizon. The chorus of voices returned, not fractured now, not overlapping in confusion, but harmonized, carrying a single resonance. They were not telling him what to do. They were reminding him that every step mattered, that no door was empty, that each choice left an imprint. Rick pressed harder, and the light enveloped him. The surface yielded, bending inward, pulling him into its depth. His vision blurred with fragments of worlds spinning past, a sky filled with endless versions of himself, each one shaped by different choices, each one walking their own hallways. He saw himself as a builder of bridges, as a wanderer through stars, as someone who chose stillness instead of motion. The weight of it nearly crushed him. So many selves, so many lives, and yet, deep in his chest, he felt a quiet calm rise. He didn't need to see them all. He didn't need to fear the immensity. He only needed to choose. His steps carried him forward, slow, deliberate. The light softened, no longer blinding but warm, embracing him like the voices of his childhood toys whispering in the dark. For the first time since this began, he felt no distance between who he was and who he was becoming. The boy who had once stood beyond the mirror was no longer separate, no longer a guide. That boy had always been him. Rick exhaled, steady, and stepped fully into the threshold. The door closed behind him without sound, leaving only the hum that had always followed him, the hum that now felt like his own breath. And as the light folded around him, carrying him deeper, he understood that this journey was not toward one place or one answer, but toward the unending act of becoming. What waited on the other side was not certainty, but possibility, and he was ready to walk into it. The light that carried him forward did not fade abruptly, but softened gradually, like the slow dimming of a lantern in a quiet room. Rick felt himself suspended in a space that wasn't quite solid, wasn't quite air. It was as though he was drifting inside the pause between breaths, weightless but aware. Shapes flickered at the edge of his vision. Doorways, fragments of hallways, glimpses of skies, both familiar and strange. Each appeared for only a heartbeat before dissolving again, as if testing his attention, asking if he was ready to notice them. Then slowly the ground returned beneath his feet. It was not glass-like as before, nor living light. It was soft, yielding, almost like earth, though it glowed faintly with a warmth that spread upward through his body. Rick steadied himself, blinking against the haze, and when the air cleared, he found he was standing in what felt like a garden. Not the kind of garden he had known as a child, with weeds and fences and the smell of soil, but one that seemed to stretch forever, alive with plants that shimmered like threads of starlight. Trees grew in spirals, their branches bending inward as if whispering secrets to one another, and streams of liquid light wound gently across the ground, humming in harmony with the gear still warm in his palm. For a moment, he simply stood in awe. This place did not feel like a destination. It felt like a memory of something eternal, something that had been waiting long before he ever touched the mirror. He walked forward, his steps quiet, the soft ground shifting slightly beneath him as though it welcomed his presence. The air smelled faintly sweet, not of flowers but of something simpler, like the memory of childhood comfort, of nights when he had once fallen asleep with the murmurs of his toys beside him. And then he realized he was not alone. At first he thought it was a trick of the light. Shapes moved among the trees, shadows that flickered like the glint of water. But as his eyes adjusted, he saw them clearly. Figures, walking slowly, their outlines faint but familiar. Versions of himself scattered through the garden. Some older, some younger, some carrying tools, others carrying nothing at all. None looked directly at him, but he knew them instantly, with a recognition deeper than sight. They were the possibilities he had glimpsed before, the selves that had lived out different paths, and here they were together, not separate but woven into the same living tapestry. Rick's chest tightened, not with fear but with something softer, a reverence that made his breath tremble. One of the figures paused as it passed him, a version of himself with lines on his face, eyes heavy but kind. This self gave him a faint nod, nothing more, and continued walking, dissolving slowly into the luminous. Trees! The acknowledgement was enough. It told Rick that he was not here to replace them, not here to erase their choices. He was here to join them. The gear pulsed again in his hand, stronger this time, and the garden responded. The streams of light curved toward him, converging, their glow brightening until they formed a path ahead. He followed it, moving deeper into the garden, past the spiraled trees and the murmuring streams, until the path led him to a clearing at its heart. In the center stood a single tree larger than all the rest, its branches rising like a crown, its trunk etched with spirals that matched the gear. Rick approached slowly, feeling the quiet weight of its presence. The tree was alive in a way that defied description. Its leaves glimmered faintly with fragments of memory, each one glowing with a different moment, his toys whispering, his first glimpse of the mirror, the boy's raised hand across the glass. As the leaves swayed, the memories shifted, carrying not just his life, but echoes of all the selves that had come before and all the ones yet to be. Rick reached out and touched the trunk. The spirals carved into the bark flared softly, and for an instant the voices of the countless selves rose together in a single harmonious chord. They weren't guiding him. They weren't commanding him. They were welcoming him into something far larger than he had ever imagined. And in that moment, Rick understood that every choice he had made, the toys, the mirror, the boy, the machine, the door, had been leading him here, not to an ending, to a place where all beginnings met. Rick kept his hand pressed against the great tree, feeling the spirals carved into its bark pulse softly under his palm. The hum that filled the garden deepened, no longer only around him, but within him, as though his own heartbeat had joined with the rhythm of the tree. The leaves shimmered brighter, their countless fragments of memory glowing like stars caught in a breeze, and for a moment Rick felt himself dissolve into them. He was no longer a single figure standing in a clearing, but part of something vast, something threaded together by endless versions of himself, each one carrying its own quiet truth. He closed his eyes, and the memories rushed through him, not as scattered glimpses this time, but as a stream, fluid, seamless. He saw his first toy humming in the dark, the mirror glowing with impossible light, the boy waiting patiently in the hallway, the machine unfolding like a flower, the doorway blooming into possibility. They weren't separate anymore. They were one story, one path winding back on itself like the spirals etched into the tree. When he opened his eyes, the garden had changed. The figures he had glimpsed before, the other versions of himself, were closer now, surrounding the clearing, their outlines clearer, their presence heavier. Some smiled faintly, some stood silent, but all of them faced him, as though acknowledging that he had reached the heart of what they had once sought. Rick didn't feel fear in their presence. He felt recognized, affirmed. They were not ghosts. They were companions, walking the same thread through different turns of the spiral. The tree's spirals flared brighter beneath his hand, and the gear in his palm glowed in answer. He held it up, and the patterns aligned perfectly, the etchings on wood and metal merging into a single continuous design. The air thickened, alive with energy, and the voices of the selves rose again, not as a chorus of many, but as one voice, vast and whole, carrying the weight of unity. Rick understood. This was not about choosing one door, one life, one destiny over another. It was about embracing all of them, knowing that every step, every variation, every whisper mattered. The machine had given him a bridge, the door had given him passage, but the tree was giving him something deeper, belonging. He felt the spiral of the gear sink into his hand, no longer separate, no longer something he carried. It became part of him, etched into his skin as light, flowing up his arm and into his chest. The glow spread through him until it filled his entire body, warm and steady, and when he looked again at the figures surrounding him, he saw the same light flickering within them. They were not distant anymore. They were connected, all drawn into the same living pattern. Rick let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The garden swayed gently as though exhaling with him, the streams of light bending toward the great tree, the leaves trembling with a quiet resonance. Everything was alive, everything was listening, and for the first time since his journey began, Rick felt the weight inside him ease into peace. He stood there in the glow of the tree, surrounded by every self he had been and every self he might become, and knew with absolute clarity that the spiral had no end. It only widened, carrying him forward into what waited next. The glow within Rick did not fade. It lingered, steady, as though the great tree had folded a piece of itself into him. His skin no longer felt like a boundary, but like a surface where light and shadow met and passed freely through. The figures of his other selves around the clearing began to dissolve slowly, not vanishing, but blending back into the garden, their outlines stretching into the streams of light, into the spiraled branches above, into the air itself. He watched them with quiet reverence, and for the first time, he didn't feel the sharp ache of loneliness that had once driven him. Wherever they went, he was with them, and wherever he stepped, they were with him. The tree trembled faintly, as if exhaling after a long silence. Leaves drifted downward, not with weight, but like sparks of memory floating through air. Rick caught one in his hand. It was cool, delicate, and the instant his skin touched it, the memory inside flared. Himself as a boy sitting in his old room, the mirror glowing faintly, his toys whispering softly in the dark. He felt the ache of longing in that moment, the curiosity, the loneliness. And he smiled. He understood now that none of it had been wasted. Every whisper, every night spent building alone, had been part of this spiral leading him here. The leaf dissolved into light, sinking into his palm. He turned back to the tree, sensing that it was not finished with him yet. The spirals carved into its trunk shifted, aligning into a shape he had never seen before. Not a doorway this time, but a circle, whole and unbroken. The light within the pattern grew brighter, spreading across the roots into the ground, and Rick felt the garden stir around him. The air vibrated, the streams pulsed faster, and the crown of the tree stretched higher as though responding to something beyond the sky. He stepped closer, resting his hand against the circle on the trunk, and the resonance surged through him. Stronger than anything before, he gasped, his knees trembling, but he didn't let go. Images rushed into him again, not of past or future, but of something wider. Endless doors scattered across universes, countless lives weaving in and out, every choice unfolding into another. He saw not only himself but others, voices and faces he didn't recognize, lives moving in spirals that touched and parted and touched again. The pattern was infinite, alive, and he was inside it. Tears welled in his eyes, not from sorrow but from the weight of beauty pressing against him, too vast to contain. The garden seemed to breathe with him, and the great tree bent ever so slightly, its branches lowering as though bowing toward him. He whispered into the quiet, not knowing if he was speaking to the tree, to the other selves, or to the spiral itself. "I understand." The circle of light beneath his hand widened, stretching outward until it became a portal glowing at the tree's base. Not a door shaped for escape, not a mirror reflecting what he already knew, but something larger, a threshold born from connection itself. The hum in the air steadied, not demanding, not urgent, but patient. The spiral had opened again, and it waited for him to step forward. Rick drew a slow breath, the glow within him matching the glow of the circle, and felt no hesitation. He knew now that every step he took would not only carry him further, but also ripple outward, touching every self, every voice, every choice woven into the spiral. He was not leaving anything behind. He was carrying it with him, and with that certainty he stepped toward the circle, ready to see where the spiral would lead him next. The glow of the circle wrapped around Rick like a tide as he stepped forward, and for a moment the garden fell away, dissolving into streams of light that pulled him gently through. His body felt weightless, his breath suspended, as though he were moving not through space but through the very veins of the spiral itself. The sensation was not disorienting but strangely calm, as if he were being carried by something that had been waiting for him all along. He closed his eyes, yet the images still flooded through. Doors upon doors, branches of choices splitting endlessly, and threads of light connecting them all. Then his feet touched solid ground again. Slowly he opened his eyes. The world before him was not the garden, nor the endless halls of mirrors he had walked before, but something in between. It was a vast plain of silver earth stretching under a sky that shimmered with colours shifting like liquid glass. The horizon curved gently, as though he stood inside a sphere, yet there was no confinement, only the sense that this place existed at the very centre of everything. The air was still, waiting, filled with the quiet hum of the spiral resonating through every grain of soil. Rick looked down at himself and saw that the glow within him pulsed brighter here, responding to the rhythm of the ground beneath his feet. He raised his hand and the light flared, threads extending outward like invisible lines, mapping themselves into the silver plain. The threads bent and curved until they formed a spiral beneath him, echoing the same pattern he had seen in the tree, in the mirrors, in every vision. He understood instinctively this was the heart, the convergence where all paths met. As he stood there, shapes began to emerge at the edge of the spiral. At first they were faint, like shadows of memories, but slowly they solidified, figures walking toward him. Some bore his face, like echoes of choices he had not lived, while others were strangers, unfamiliar, yet tied to him by the same threads of light. They did not speak, but their presence pressed against him with meaning. He felt their burdens, their triumphs, their doubts, all flowing through him as naturally as breath. The spiral was not his alone, it belonged to all of them. A sudden tremor rippled across the plain, and the spiral beneath his feet began to turn. Slowly at first, then faster, until the threads of light twisted and reached outward like rivers seeking the sea. The figures around him held their ground, their eyes fixed on him as though waiting for his choice. He realized that the spiral would not move without him. His steps determined its direction. Every choice he made here would ripple outward, shaping not only his path but theirs as well. He closed his eyes again, listening. The hum of the spiral grew louder, almost a song now, and within it he could hear faint voices, whispers of his past selves, fragments of futures not yet lived, and tones of countless others interwoven. For the first time he felt no fear of making the wrong choice. There was no wrong. Every step was part of the whole. Opening his eyes, he placed one foot forward onto the moving spiral, and the ground lit up beneath him, threads surging outward into the vast plain. The figures around him bowed their heads, not in submission but in recognition, as though acknowledging that his step had set something in motion. The spiral turned faster, lifting him slightly from the earth, carrying him upward. The silver plain receded, the figures fading back into light, until all that remained was the vast spiral, endless and alive, pulling him toward its center. Rick's heart pounded, but his breath was steady. He no longer felt like a wanderer searching for answers. He felt like part of the answer itself, drawn forward by the very pattern he had once only glimpsed in shadows. Whatever waited at the heart of the spiral, he was ready to face it, for it was not separate from him. It had always been calling him home. The spiral lifted him higher, yet there was no sense of falling away from the world he had known. Instead, it was as though the world itself folded upward to meet him, curving around into layers of light and sound that wrapped into the turning spiral. The silver plain dissolved beneath him, replaced by an endless expanse of shifting currents, each one alive with motion. They shimmered like rivers of glass, weaving together and pulling apart, converging and diverging in infinite directions. Rick realized with startling clarity that these were not simply paths, but living strands of time, each one carrying choices, lives, and consequences across their lengths. The glow within his chest pulsed stronger in response. Every beat aligned with the rhythm of the spiral, and the more he focused, the more clearly he could hear the currents whisper. They carried voices, fragments of stories, echoes of laughter and sorrow, and the faintest trace of his own steps scattered through them. It was overwhelming, 1,000 lifetimes brushing against his mind, yet instead of drowning, he felt buoyed, as though the currents lifted him gently forward. The spiral narrowed, pulling him closer to its heart. From the currents emerged shapes, first like flickers of light, then slowly sharpening into structures. Towering arches rose above him, made not of stone or steel, but of woven threads of time, bending and meeting in patterns that mirrored the spiral's design. Beneath them, bridges of light extended into the distance, crossing over rivers of shifting memory. This was no ordinary realm. It was the architecture of the spiral itself, the hidden order behind every step he had taken. As Rick advanced, the air changed. A tension vibrated through the arches, as though the spiral were aware of him. Ahead, at the far end of a glowing bridge, stood a figure unlike the shadow echoes he had seen before. This one was solid, radiant, and waiting. Cloaked in shifting colours, neither man nor woman, neither young nor old, its presence pressed against him with the weight of recognition. The threads of the spiral converged around the figure, streaming into it as though it were their anchor. Rick paused, his breath caught in his throat. He had felt the pull of the spiral guiding him all this time, but standing here, facing the one who seemed to embody its core, he understood that he had not simply been walking towards something. He had been drawn to a meeting that had always been inevitable. The figure raised its hand, and the bridge trembled, glowing brighter. The currents beneath swelled, rising in waves of light that flickered with images. His journey through the mirrors, the garden, the silver plain, and countless other moments he had glimpsed only faintly. They rose like a tide around him, carrying his past, his choices, and his unspoken questions into the space between them. Rick's pulse matched the rhythm of the spiral, steady and unbroken. He stepped forward, the bridge solid beneath his feet, though every instinct told him this was not a step into certainty but into revelation. The figure's gaze locked onto him, silent yet demanding, as though the spiral itself awaited his voice. And for the first time since his journey began, Rick felt that the next word, the next breath he spoke, would not only shape his path, but decide how the spiral itself would turn. The silence between them stretched, yet it was not empty. It pulsed, alive, heavy with meaning that pressed on Rick's chest until he felt the air itself tighten around him. The figure's presence was not merely before him, it was within him, threaded into every memory, every hesitation, every choice that had carried him here. For a moment, he did not know if he was standing at the edge of something greater or staring into a reflection of himself, magnified by the spiral's truth. When he opened his mouth, no sound came. The bridge itself seemed to hum in answer, filling the absence with a resonance that wrapped around his heart. The figure inclined its head, a gesture neither kind nor cruel, but one that urged him forward, silently demanding acknowledgement. Rick forced his voice through the weight pressing down on him, the single question that had been burning since he first stepped into the spiral. "Why me?" The words trembled in the air, swallowed almost instantly by the rushing currents beneath, but instead of fading, they echoed back, multiplied, carried along the rivers of light until the entire spiral seemed to murmur with the same phrase. "Why me? Why me? Why me?" The figure did not flinch, did not answer in speech, but raised both hands outward. At once the arches above burst with brilliance, unravelling into streams that cascaded downward, weaving a tapestry of visions around him. Rick staggered back, shielding his eyes, but the light forced itself upon him. He saw his own past scattered like shards, moments he had thought forgotten, moments that had guided him invisibly, the choice to leave one road and take another, the fleeting glance exchanged with a stranger, the hesitation before a single word was spoken. Each fragment was insignificant in isolation, yet now they interlaced into a pattern, converging toward this very meeting. He had been walking paths laid long before he knew their shape. The figure's voice finally came, low and resonant, though it did not move its lips. It spoke inside him, vibrating through his bones. "You are not chosen. You are inevitable." The words lodged in his chest like stone. Not chosen, not special, simply inevitable, as though everything he had believed to be free will was merely the spiral bending him toward this point. The revelation struck him with equal measures of terror and clarity. He realized then that the spiral was not offering him destiny. It was revealing the truth that he had never strayed from it. The currents around the bridge swelled higher, glowing fiercely, until the sound of their rushing drowned out thought itself. The figure lowered its hands, and the visions collapsed into a single image suspended in the air before him, a doorway of pure darkness, framed by the spiral's light. It pulsed faintly, as though it breathed, waiting. Rick's pulse thudded in unison with it, caught between dread and compulsion. He knew the bridge led only to that doorway, and the figure's gaze, unyielding, wordless, made clear that turning back was no longer possible. The spiral had brought him here not to ask, but to decide whether he would step into the void that would end the path he knew and begin one he could not imagine. He stood at the edge, the silence stretching again, the doorway yawning open with a pull that was both invitation and demand. And as his breath steadied, Rick understood that whatever lay beyond was not simply the next step of his journey, but the unraveling of the very question that had driven him from the beginning. Rick's breath caught as he stood before the dark doorway, its pulse matching the rhythm of his own heartbeat. The figure did not move closer, nor did it push him forward. Its stillness was more commanding than any force could be. The silence surrounding them had shifted, no longer an emptiness but a suspension, as though the entire spiral itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to make the step that would determine everything. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingertips brushing the threshold of the darkness. It was not cold, nor warm, but something in between, an indifference that unsettled him more than extremes ever could. The surface rippled at his touch, absorbing him gently, and for a moment he thought he felt it listening, testing his resolve. He drew his hand back, unsettled by the sensation that the void had learned something about him in that instant. Behind him, the spiral's rivers of light surged brighter, their colors deepening into shades that seemed to blur into one another. The echoes of his question, "Why me?" still drifted faintly, dissolving now into whispers that seemed to merge with the heartbeat of the doorway itself. He felt the pull stronger, not as a command but as inevitability. The words spoken earlier by the figure returned to him, heavy and undeniable, inevitable. Rick inhaled slowly, his chest tight, as though every breath was being measured. He glanced back at the figure, searching for reassurance, but found none. Its face remained unreadable, its presence neither hostile nor comforting, and in that neutrality he understood. No answer would come, no guidance offered. This choice, though inevitable, was still his to enact. He steadied his stance, his palms damp, and let his gaze rest on the living void before him. For the first time, he sensed not just fear, but curiosity stirring beneath the weight of dread. What lay beyond was unknown, yes, but within that unknown flickered the faintest trace of possibility. He realized that stepping forward was not surrender, it was discovery, the acceptance that certainty had never existed at all. The spiral shuddered, a tremor running through the bridge beneath his feet, urging him to act. The rivers swelled, the arches above hummed like strings drawn to breaking, and in that crescendo, Rick felt the truth. The spiral itself could not continue until he did. Every strand of light, every current of time was waiting for him to move. He exhaled, a sound shaky but resolute, and let his foot rise. The moment his soul crossed the threshold, the darkness surged outward, swallowing the bridge, the spiral, even the figure that had guided him here. He felt the world collapse into silence, not the silence of absence, but the silence of transformation, of something vast shifting its shape around him. And as the last glimmer of the spiral dissolved, Rick's body was no longer his anchor. He was falling, or rising, or both at once, carried into a realm that defied direction. The void was not empty, it was alive, filled with whispers too distant to understand, shadows that moved with intent just beyond his vision, and a weightless pull that dragged him deeper. For a fleeting instant, he thought he saw the outline of another doorway forming within the void, brighter than the spiral's light, sharp and beckoning. But before he could fix his gaze upon it, the whispers swelled louder, wrapping around him like unseen hands. His breath caught, and the realization struck him with terrifying clarity. Stepping into the void was not the end of inevitability. It was only the beginning. The whispers pressed closer, wrapping around Rick like threads of unseen fabric, binding him without touch. He drifted deeper into the void, though he no longer felt his body move in any direction. Time was unraveling, folding in on itself, each second expanding into an eternity before collapsing back into silence. His breath came slow, as if it too belonged to the rhythm of this strange place. Shapes began to emerge, faint at first, like fragments of memory surfacing from the depths of a forgotten dream. A child's laughter echoing against a stone wall, the flicker of a candle in a storm, a shadow that lingered too long behind him. Each image dissolved before he could grasp it, leaving behind only the unease of recognition, as though the void was sifting through the archive of his life, selecting what to show and what to withhold. Then, in the distance, a light broke through. Not the soft glow of the spiral, nor the harsh shimmer of the doorway, but a pale, wavering flame that seemed impossibly fragile against the immensity of the darkness. Rick felt himself drawn toward it, not by force but by a pull more intimate, as if something within the flame was calling his name without sound. The whispers rose, their tones clashing, some urging him forward, others warning him to turn away. He clenched his fists, though he wasn't sure if his hand still existed, and pressed on. Each step, if it could be called that, sent ripples through the void, bending the whispers into distorted echoes. He felt both watched and weighed, every fragment of his being tested by an unseen tribunal. As he neared the flame, he saw it was not alone. Shapes moved within its glow, figures, tall and indistinct, standing as though in council. Their outlines wavered like smoke, yet their presence was heavy, ancient, undeniable. Rick slowed, his chest tight with both awe and fear. The figures did not speak, yet their silence pressed upon him like judgment. The flame flared, and within it he glimpsed his own face, fractured into countless reflections, each one bearing a different expression: rage, grief, longing, defiance. They shifted too quickly for him to hold, yet each struck him with the weight of truth. He stumbled, overwhelmed, his voice breaking out before he could stop it. "What do you want from me?" The words dissolved into the void, but the flame answered, not with sound, but with vision. The spiral reappeared before him, collapsing into itself, the doorway breaking into shards, the figure that had guided him fading into nothing. Then came a single image, sharp and undeniable, a path ahead, endless and unfinished, waiting for his step to define it. Rick's breath hitched, his throat dry as realization seeped through him. The void was not leading him, it was offering itself to him. The inevitability was not a chain, but a mirror, forcing him to confront what he would choose to shape within it. The thought was both liberating and terrifying, heavier than any command could have been. The figures in the flame shifted closer, their smoke-like outlines merging with the edges of his reflection. The whispers quieted, as though the tribunal awaited his answer. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a space carved for him alone, demanding not submission, but decision. And in that fragile stillness, Rick understood. He was no longer being carried forward. The next step, for the first time, was his.